Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our lecture today. So I first wanted to give a credit to Dr. Seaman and Dr. Salma Mohammed for really organizing this event here for Creighton. And I want to introduce Jessica Seaman. For those on the Omaha campus who do not know Jessica, Jessica is the Assistant Dean for Faculty Development and Education for Creighton University on both campuses. So, Jessica.
Thank you so much. And thank you for joining us for one of our many September professional development sessions. We're having several a month now, so we're very excited to be able to get out a lot of different kinds of programming to you. We are going to be hearing advancing outcomes-based medical education in the post-pandemic era. And this is hosted by Creighton University School of Medicine. I'm Dr. Jessica Seaman, Assistant Dean for Faculty Development in Creighton School of Medicine. And I have just a few housekeeping items before I introduce our speaker. This session is being recorded, and you will have access to the recording and the slide presentation for future reference. We invite you to ask live questions for those of you that are here, or submit questions in the chat for those on Zoom, and we'll get to many as we can by the end of the session. Those on Zoom, we ask that you remain muted with video off unless asking a live question to assist with the recording. Also, this session is eligible for CE credit, and you will receive the website and activity code before we conclude. There is a short survey associated with the continuing education. I think it's maybe 5 questions. It's very short. And we do thank you in advance for providing feedback as we continue to build this robust programming for our staff and faculty at Creighton. Now, to introduce our wonderful speaker. Dr. Eric Holmboe is Chief Research Milestones Development and Evaluation Officer at the Accreditation Council for GME. So you may have heard it as ACGME. He is Adjunct Professor of Medicine at Yale University School of Medicine and Uniformed Services University of Health Sciences. He is also an adjunct professor of medical education at the Feinberg School of Medicine at Northwestern University. Dr. Holmboe previously served as the Associate Program Director, Yale Primary Care Internal Medicine Residency Program, Director of Student Clinical Assessment, Yale School of Medicine, and Assistant Director of Yale Robert Wood Johnson Clinical Scholars. We are very grateful for Dr. Holmboe's willingness to share his time and knowledge with us around outcomes-based medical education. And we'll now turn the time over to him. Dr. Holmboe.
Thank you. First off, thanks for having me. Full disclosure, this is my first trip to a university in over 2.5 years. So it's a real privilege to be able to do this again. I hope this will be helpful for you today. I really want to talk about how can we accelerate or advance outcomes-based medical education. And I put post in parentheses because the reality is we're not done. And you know that much better than I do. So I still think that we're in the midst of this pandemic as we're dealing with what are called syndemics. Things like gun violence and unfortunately, issues of systemic racism, et cetera, are still kind of coalescing to create real problems for our society. Just real quickly, my disclosures. So here's the outline for my talk, and I hope we'll have some time for some questions. I'm going to talk a little bit about what the pandemic exposed, and then I'm going to talk about what do we mean by outcomes in health professions education. Then I'm going to introduce you to something called the core components framework for competency-based medical education, which I think is really helpful as a way to think moving forward the design of our educational programs. And then I'll talk a little bit about milestones and entrustable professional activities that would operationalize that. We'll talk about the importance of programmatic assessment using a system lens, and then we'll talk about opportunities and challenges moving forward. I would be remiss, however, if I didn't start with a thank you. We're well aware at ACGME just how difficult the last 2.5 years have been, how this has affected all of you. These are kind of two of my favorite graphics. The one on the left was actually created by a Mexican artist early in the pandemic. These are all healthcare providers who died from COVID and was turned into this mural. The one on the right is from Pat Bagley, who's a cartoonist at Salt Lake City Tribune. When, as we saw a shift in what was happening in the hospitals from kind of the early kind of seeing you all as heroes that you are, to having to deal with a lot of folks who were deniers about the pandemic, whether it be with regard to vaccines and other things, and the kind of pressure this one put on all of you. As I said, we know this had a major impact on U.S. medical education. These are just some examples of what changed, right? We moved a lot of stuff into the virtual environment. There were definitely some challenges with that, but I would argue we probably learned some things about how we can do things differently moving forward. The graph up on the left is what we called originally our pandemic status. And so, as you know, institutions could ask the ACGME for some relief by declaring pandemic status. And we track this on a regular basis. We looked at this every day to see how many institutions were being affected, how many were on pandemic status, and what were the proportion of residents affected in any given time. And then I think, as you all know, this had a profound impact on families, where they weren't able to visit loved ones. A lot of isolation, unfortunately, patients dying alone, unable to see the family. And we know for a fact, in talking with a number of residents, as well as faculty, that that's created some moral distress. And it is something I think that's going to have a long tail on it as we come out on the other side of this pandemic. I think the pandemic also exposed some other things. These are not new issues, but I think that they got really more exposed during the pandemic. For example, our kind of reliance on time and training as a proxy for competence began to fall apart, right? The usual proxies for assessment were significantly altered and disrupted, such as relying on the volume of procedures or the distribution of the kind of clinical cases you saw because folks were redeployed. Rotations were completely disrupted. For many of our medical students, particularly in the height of it, they weren't able to get the electives that they had hoped to do in order to prepare for their internship and so forth. And high stakes examinations got disrupted, right? The clinical skills exam for step 2 was discontinued permanently. And so trying to figure out where to go with that. Step 1 went pass fail. The boards really struggled on how to deliver certification exams. And the other thing, we knew this was an issue, but it really highlighted the gaps around these transitions, that they're not very planned, not terribly systematic, they're very abrupt, and they just got exacerbated. Transition from medical school into graduate medical education, residency to fellowship, and even residency out and fellowship out into practice. These got terribly disrupted. And so there was kind of some interesting shared observations as we've had conversations. There was kind of this kind of, realization that if we had been farther along with outcomes-based medical education, dealing with the pandemic would have been a lot easier. In other words, if we had less reliance on these proxies, counting number of rotations, that would have made life easier. We didn't have such a heavy reliance on high stakes testing and so forth. And so I think that hopefully has created some kind of recognition that we have an opportunity to embrace more fully this concept of outcomes-based medical education. So let's start with a definition and talk about purpose. So this is an article that goes back to 2010. It's from the Lancet Commission. It was work led by Julio Frank, who actually is a physician originally from Mexico, but spent most of his career in public health and is currently the president of University of Miami. And this graphic I thought was really helpful. What they pointed out in the 20th century, we had a heavy reliance on structured curriculum because if you go back to Flexner and other reports from 1910, we didn't have structured curriculum. And so it made sense that we kind of introduced that into medical education. And from that curriculum, we wrote educational objectives. Just show of hands, how many people have actually written educational objectives? Yeah, and you use them every day, right? I don't know about you, mine ended up on a shelf. And so the problem was, how do we actually operationalize those objectives? And we may or may not do some assessment, thus the dotted line. And in the 20th century, the predominant focus of assessment was on what? Knowledge, what you knew, right? That was really the kind of belief was, if you're really smart, you're going to be fine. And then certainly the procedural disciplines, there was a kind of apprenticeship type model where you would work inside of an expert. But they argued we had it backwards, that what we really needed to do was start with the health and healthcare needs of the systems and people we serve. And that should be grounded in the quadruple aim, right? The 6 aims of quality from the Institute of Medicine from 2001, the health of a population, the cost of care, and then the 4th aim really focused on the well-being of our healthcare workforce. We hadn't paid enough attention to that. More recently, folks have argued for a quintuple aim with more explicit attention to the inequities in our healthcare system. And then from those needs should flow the competencies and outcomes of interest, right? And then and only then do you put together curriculum and assessment. Now, the one thing I don't like about this slide is it makes it look like curriculum and assessment are separate activities and they're isolated, and they're not. They're highly interdependent. You've all heard the adage, assessment drives learning. Absolutely true. We want to make sure it does it in a way that's effective and appropriate. But sometimes we forget about the learning side of that equation, when learning should also drive the right kind of assessment for the purposes of professional development. And so with regards to what outcomes-based medical education is, there's been a lot of work literally for decades defining it. This is a nice article from Ron Harden, who's been one of the leaders. He just recently retired from the Association of Medical Education in Europe. And it's pretty straightforward, right? You start with the end in mind. You think about what type of physician you want to produce to meet the needs of society. And the structure and processes of your programs and your assessments flow from those outcomes. And as he pointed out, as others have for decades, those educational outcomes have to be clearly and unambiguously specified, right? We have to know what they look like when they leave us, because those outcomes should determine your curriculum, the timetable for your training program, what teaching methods and strategies you'd use. We had a wonderful workshop earlier today from Jessica and others about techniques that we can use to improve our teaching. Assessment processes and learning environment all flow from those educational outcomes. So one of the ways to operationalize outcomes-based medical education is competency-based medical education, right? And so this is a definition from also 2010, led by an international group, Jason Frank at the Royal College in Canada, who pointed out that CBME is an approach to preparing physicians for practice that is fundamentally oriented to graduate outcome abilities and organized around competencies that are derived from analysis of societal and patient needs. It's really important. CBME is designed to be more learner-centered, right? To be more time flexible, and also promote greater accountability, particularly to the society. So how do we operationalize that? This is where the core components framework, I think, can be really helpful. It was recently published. This is work led by Elaine Van Mel, Queen's University in Canada. And what she found through a series of literature review and Delphi process is the kind of 5 really core components. It's not there isn't other things, there are. But these are kind of 5 essential core components. The first is you need a competency framework to define the educational outcomes. For us, it's the 6 general competencies that are further specified through the milestones. And the others are to sequence progressively a learner's curriculum or experience, to tailor those learning experiences based on where they are, and to make sure that our instruction is focused on the abilities that are needed for effective practice. And then finally, to support all this, we need a program of assessment, or often referred to as programmatic assessment, using a systems approach. Now, as you look at those last 4 columns, I hope there's a word that really jumps out at you, and that's developmental. This is always meant to be a developmental system. But if you think about a curriculum, we don't necessarily design it that way. Think about the intern who starts in the ICU in July or August versus the one who gets to do the ICU in April or May. It's a very different experience that may not align with where they are developmentally. And so all of these things really get at that concept of development. And one of the things I really like about this is that the core components framework is grounded in what's known as a growth or reform mindset, right? Those who may be familiar, Carol Dweck's work. And it's really important because this growth or reform mindset forms the basis for redesigning our assessment practices, instructional methods, and learning experiences. Importantly, it's focused on promoting learner growth and development through frequent formative assessments. In other words, assessments for learning, not so much assessment of learning. It has to be rich in feedback and coaching that is individualized to the learner based on where they are and grounded again in those competencies because those define the abilities necessary for unsupervised practice. And finally, it has to provide rich and diverse learning experiences that is steeped in clinical practice. But here's a really important point, where learners can stay as long as required. Right? We're stuck because we have financing models that makes this difficult. But we know we sometimes let people go before they're really ready. Right? Everybody loses in that situation, not the least of which is the patients, right? If they're having to see somebody who just isn't prepared. Ironically, in the military, this was not an issue for us. First off, we got a captive audience, so that helps, as Jim knows, my good friend, who, by the way, this is Dr. Jim Smith, if you don't know. I'm going to call him out because he delivered my daughter. And I'm still paying for that 27 years later, so we can talk about that offline. But in the military, as Jim knows, sometimes folks just weren't ready. For us to send somebody out into the fleet on an aircraft carrier in the middle of the Pacific not being ready was a disaster waiting to happen. And so we extended a number of folks in our medicine program because we could. And guess what? They did fine, right? Some of them actually went on to be, wait for it, a chief resident. So I think this is a really important point and why I like this framework so much. So let's walk through the components for a moment. I won't spend too much time. These are the 6 general competencies. I know you love these. But I would make the point that love them or hate them, they have required us to focus on things that have been missing. A lot of these did not exist when I trained. And to be honest, I wish they had. I would have been better prepared. Interprofessional teamwork was not part of the vocabulary when I was a resident. Systems thinking? That sounds like something from an engineering school. My dad was a mechanical engineer, right? But they're things that we need. And so if not competencies specify outcomes, then what? And at some point they will be replaced. That's just the natural evolution, right, of our science. But I think they do call out really important abilities that we all need. Now, a lot of people get confused with the terminology, so I'm going to just take a moment to define a term here, and that's competency. So when you see competency that ends with a Y or an IES, it really means just an observable ability of an individual that integrates knowledge, skills, attitudes, etc. It's in some respects an unfortunate term because it often gets confused with competence, which is really a state or stage of development, and competency, which is really more of a noun and really refers to ability. But it goes back historically, and so it's kind of stuck. But when you see that, that's what that means. And so the other thing to think about this competency framework is that they're just that. They're nothing more than a way to organize our thinking. Think of them as scaffolding, right, to guide our curriculum and assessment. They help us build shared mental models so we know what's important and what abilities are needed. But here's another really important point. They do not represent the totality of a discipline or of all professional development. They're the core competencies. There's a lot of white space around them. That's where your experience, your judgment, expertise, wisdom remains vitally important. We require and need for you to leverage that to best prepare somebody. This isn't the end all and be all, but they do help us to define the educational outcomes or abilities of our graduates. And so if we're thinking developmentally, I want to spend a little bit of time on this concept of progressive sequencing and tailoring of learning and teaching. I don't know if folks recognize this, but there's a number of stage models of development. This is actually one from Robert Keegan at Harvard about what we experience as we move through our own careers. And our goal is to kind of get up to that meta leader, right? That self-transforming mind. But this concept of progressive sequencing doesn't just happen during GME. It's something we experience throughout our entire lives. And so as we think about the development and that progressive sequencing, it's important to recognize that what our learners are experiencing is this concept of a learning curve. Strongly recommend this article from Martin Pusick from 2014, And what you'll notice right away is that this curve is not a nice 45-degree incline. It's sigmoidal. And your learners, whether they be in medical school or residency or fellowship, they will spend the majority of the time with you on the steep part of that curve. And if you stop and think about it, I'm a general internist by training, what happens to somebody in 3 years is pretty remarkable. When they come out of medical school and 3 years later, they're going to become a practicing physician in a relatively short period of time when the career will span 40 to 45 years. Pretty remarkable. Our goal for them is to reach proficiency by the time of graduation. They will not be experts, most of them. That's anticipated. But it is our job to prepare them to continue that journey to become a deliberate expert. And the way we can organize that, again, is where the competencies come in. And just to make the point from that same article, what Martin did is he had 18 pediatric residents who were rotating through the emergency department read a series of ankle radiographs. In fact, he had them read over 200. Some were normal, some had certain lesions, some were fractures, et cetera. And basically, they got feedback on whether or not they missed it, but they didn't get much more training. And so he looked at their kind of developmental curve. If you look on the left, guess what? It's that steep, kind of incline early on, and then there's gradual improvement as a group. Right? Makes sense. Looks very much like the learning curve I just showed you. But shift your gaze to the right. That's the 18 individual patterns. Some folks are pretty good at it. They get pretty accurate pretty quickly, but then they plateau. What Anders Ericsson calls arrested development, not the sitcom with, but others really struggle even to get to 2/3 accuracy after reading over 200 films of feedback. Right? We're different. We just have different paths. So the question is, how do you tailor the learning so that those folks who are actually really good don't plateau, and the others who are struggling can be accelerated or given the type of training they need to get better at this? I realize that this will probably be completely taken care of by artificial intelligence. I get it. But this at least gives us an example. The Dreyfus development model has been around a long time. As I shared earlier with some of the PDs, the Dreyfus brothers were actually consultants to the development of the competencies in the late 90s. They were always intended to be developmental in their thinking. So Hubert and Stewart were actually part of that developmental process. And they basically described the 5 stages from novice to expert. Others have added a 6th level called mastery. And this is just an example of clinical reasoning, but the point is to describe what those folks look like at each stage. And they did that in a number of professions. Anybody know where they started? One of their first contracts that they developed this model? Actually, the military, teaching folks how to fly jets. They were very interested in how do you take somebody at that time was a male right out of college who can barely drive a car safely and operate a piece of machinery at Mach 2, 3 and cost several $1 million. And they actually applied this model in the Air Force, interestingly. And it's been since applied to multiple others. Another really important body of work, and I encourage you to read this book, is the concept of deliberate practice to achieve expertise. One of the leaders in this field was Anders Ericsson. Sadly, we lost suddenly in the spring of the early pandemic. A huge loss, but Anders spent years basically studying what does it take for folks to reach expertise. And as you can see in the definition here from one of his articles, it's basically individualized training activities that are especially defined by a coach or teacher to improve specific aspects of an individual's performance through repetition and successive refinement. Again, that's why your role is so important. You just don't do a one and done. See one, do one, teach one doesn't cut it. Right? It takes repetition under the watchful guise of a coach with good feedback. And the field has to be reasonably well developed. And here's something he really noticed, which struck him particularly in medicine. You need to have clear mental representations of the field in order to be fully successful. We would also know those as shared mental models. When he was working in medicine, he was struck that many times he did not see evidence of this. He saw a lot of variation and variability about what was considered optimal practice or optimal teaching. And he was curious as to how we dealt with that, because he said that he saw as one of our biggest challenges. And I think that still remains true today. And then finally, another really important body of work that supports this progressive sequencing and tailoring is something known as mastery-based learning, something, again, that's also been around a long time. If you haven't read any of the work from Bill McGahey, I would strongly recommend it. But there's some central tenets to a mastery-based approach I think are really important. First, that excellence is expected and achievable by anyone who's willing to work hard and is motivated and at least have some basic skills. Interestingly, in this mindset, there is little to no variation in the outcomes, right? This idea like, well, there's a bunch of different ways to do things is limited based on the evidence. And that learning on any domain requires learning a sequence of less complex components. There's that progressive sequencing piece and how important it is. And in their mind, if learners receive optimal quality of instruction and the time required, then they will attain mastery. And Bill and his team at Northwestern with Jeff Barsick, Diane Wayne, and others have actually proven it. For example, they use simulation for procedures. They've done it with thoracentesis, lumbar punctures, central lines, and they train them in the simulated to a mastery standard. They do not let them touch a patient until they have achieved that standard, regardless of how many repetitions it takes. Then they can go out and actually care for patients. In their central line study is one example. They saw a dramatic reduction in complications from infections, bleeding, etc. Oh, and by the way, it saved the hospital tens of thousands of dollars. Not a bad return on investment. So I think this mindset, by preparing folks and giving them as much repetitions as they needed to reach that standard, I do think at some point is going to need to become our standard. If you think about it from a patient safety perspective, kind of hard to argue against that. And so if we think developmentally, how do we do that? How do we operationalize it? Well, we can use competency milestones. And I apologize, some of the slides looks like in transfer got a bit disjointed. Anybody recognize this? This is the Denver developmental scale for kids. I'm particularly interested because I now have grandkids, kind of fun, right? 2 and 4. And so this is how we've operationalized. Instead of using something like a Denver developmental, we use words across the 5 kind of main stages using a stage model of development. And this is just an example for family medicine. This is a patient care subcompetency. And we describe in words these kind of streams of what they should look like at each stage. Understanding that it's not a nice stepwise function. They may actually be at a certain level for some of these and yet not quite there in one of the other threads. And that's fine. That's why we created the transition zones. It's perfectly fine to use those. But I want to make a couple other points here. The numbers are nothing more than a code. That's it. There's no magic in those numbers. What's really important is to focus on the narrative. Start there. Research has shown that if you start with a narrative and match folks to narratives, you're actually more likely to be accurate and discriminate. Multiple studies that have shown that. And the code is just a way to put it into the system so we can look at trajectories and help learners, particularly if they're, struggling or behind. And remember, our goal is that proficiency level coded as a 4. It is not a mandate, right? It's just a recommendation. We recognize not every learner is going to reach level 4 in everything graduation. That's fine. We hope you prepare them wherever they're headed to continue to work on those areas, or maybe they weren't quite at the level you'd hope they'd be. But that's not meant to be a mandate or a requirement. Okay, I want to really emphasize that. And so I would encourage you to use this with your learners. So milestones, as we think about going back to that learning curve, are a way to integrate curriculum and assessment to really help support that journey, right? With, again, proficiency being the recommended goal for each subcompetency. And here's what happens when you submit your data, and this is why we're so grateful for the work. We can actually track every trajectory nationally now, and we do. I want you to know that the RCs never see your milestones data. That was never the intent. It's firewalled from them. They only see national data like this. They have no idea what your milestone data is at the program level. But we've now been able to use these milestones to create learning analytics. We know they're messy. We know they're far from perfect. We know it's a struggle to make these judgments. But we have been able to use these to help give feedback through something called predictive probability values to help folks identify folks who might be struggling as early as possible. Because the purpose here is to help these folks, not to weed them out. It's like, wow, if somebody's really struggling, with a year or 18 months to go, let's intervene. Let's really figure out what we need to do to help them get to that proficiency level. And then the other way that folks have kind of been thinking about this is something called entrustment or entrustable professional activities. This is work that comes out of the Netherlands, led by Ola ten Kot, Sheila, and others. And what they did is they took something called the Miller Pyramid for assessment. And they added at the top of it that they would be trusted with future care. I think that's an important concept, right? Because when you graduate them, that's essentially what you're doing. You're making an entrustment. They're truly ready to go out and do that. And you're not going to be there to supervise either safety net anymore. They'll be able to figure that out for themselves. When they need help, they'll know when to ask for it, when they need to get additional assistance, because now they're going to have to be self-regulated to do that. And so this is another nice article I'd recommend from Ola ten Kot, that he defined trust, and I think this is important for all of us. Trust involves the confident expectation that a person, in this case the learner, can be relied on to honor implied or established commitments to another individual. And that's you, the faculty, but also the patient. And to protect that individual's interest. It renders the individual vulnerable to the extent she or he cannot oversee or control the actions of the other. And you depend on their integrity to know when to reach out to you. And again, they need help. We do this all the time, right? We make entrustments all the time. We actually schedule entrustments into our system. For example, it's called night float, right? We entrust that if they're covering overnight, we're not in the hospital, they'll know to call us, or they'll know to reach out to a more senior resident when they do that. And the person that's most affected by this whole system of trust and how we use it, again, is the patient. We have to keep that in mind. And so the way this has been operationalized, something called the entrustable professional activity, which just simply represents the routine life activities of a specialist or subspecialist. I think the most important part of this concept, again, gets back to that concept of entrustment and trustable. And this is how Ola defined it, that a practitioner has demonstrated the necessary knowledge, skills, and attitudes. I'd insert competencies there to be trusted to perform this activity unsupervised. And so a lot of folks say, well, this is really confusing. What's the difference between? So remember, competencies define the abilities of the individuals. They're about the individual, right? They're characteristics, descriptions of the individual. And milestones do nothing more than describe those competencies and developmental narratives. That's it. EPAs define the core activities that health professionals do in daily practice. So competencies are needed by an individual in order to perform the activity. I think where some of the confusion comes in, like, okay, so if I'm going to figure out what their ability is, don't I watch them do stuff? And the answer is, yeah, that's exactly what you do. You watch them do activities. And so one is breaking it apart a little bit to figure out various components, and the EPAs tend to be a bit more holistic when examining that activity. The nice thing is that you can put these together. This is actually a diagram from Ola. And ironically, this was written prior to the pandemic, so he must have been very kind of forward thinking. Maybe he's Nostradamus, but he picked provide telephone advice, which is obviously something that became quite common. And what he points out is that even to do that, you need all 6 general competencies. It's not like one or the other can be dropped. But from an assessment perspective, you might really highlight a couple of these. In this case, he chose to highlight medical knowledge, communication skills, and practice-based learning and improvement is really important to this particular activity. And because we've written these developmental narratives, we can actually kind of first go across the row where we have these narratives. And if we wanted to write a vignette or a story or a narrative, kind of building on Jessica's wonderful concept this morning, we can basically aggregate them together at each level. And so in order to do that, you now have a story of what it is they need to be able to do in order to effectively provide telephone advice or do telemedicine. Kara Karachi has also written some nice articles around this for pediatrics. And the other nice thing about this, it all aligns pretty well. It's interesting that it may be just the limits of short-term memory and human cognition, but almost all of these models that have looked at learner development or how we actually rate them using entrustment skills, guess what, are almost all 5 levels. Interesting, right? Dreyfus models, 5 levels. They have the descriptions, and then there's been various types of entrustment scales that just describe the level of supervision that's needed. And so that brings us to programmatic assessment. So as we think about this developmental trajectory and really changing our mindset to be more developmental, and then we have these kind of approaches to operationalize it, whether it be through milestones or EPAs, how do we know they're doing okay? So this is where programmatic assessment comes in. And this is just an example of what's called a spider or radar plot that kind of plots where the kind of program level tends to be, or what's expected of them, and where the learner actually is here in blue. And so this is just taken from this article, kind of showing how you can identify this learner, obviously, at their stage of training is behind, right? They're struggling. And this is kind of what this radar plot would tell you. And so if we think about it from a systems perspective, this is the system, kind of writ large. I work on the right-hand side of this diagram. I'm in that accreditation oval. Our primary unit of analysis is the program. And then on the bottom oval is the certification and credentialing functions. And there's overlap between us. You know, we work kind of in concert, and our primary constituency is the public. Here's the bottom line, though. Despite all the stuff we do, as I jokingly said earlier, we're really good at writing rules and regulations, but we're only as good as what happens inside that rectangle. That's you. You're the most important part of the system. When you think about programmatic assessment, it's a combination of various activities and components that are needed to make it be successful. In the gray box, you need a certain number of assessments. We know that you have to have a multifaceted choice of assessments. One won't do the trick. This is just one example that generates data that is both quantitative and qualitative. Narrative is data. It's important. It should come to the CCC, and that group makes a synthesis judgment, right, based on the information they have. And out of that comes a judgment that we express on a milestone. Ideally, that judgment should be shared back with the residents and fellows in conversation, right? Hopefully they've done a self-assessment and now they can compare and contrast and then generate an individualized learning plan. But those judgments should also be fed back into the program to help the program continually get better, right? Particularly if you notice that a group of residents is falling short on a subcompetency, that's a signal there may be a curricular issue, or maybe you're struggling with an assessment. And so there's an opportunity for improvement. The other thing that's really important about the system, residents have to be active agents in this. They need to contribute to assessment. We need to empower them to seek out assessment. That requires the culture inside that box to be psychologically safe in order for them to be able to do that, right? Because without that, they're taking a risk, right? But we need to have them be these active agents. And as I said, in that gray box, you have to have a minimum set of assessments in order to cover the 6 general competencies. This is what we call the kind of de minimis set, right? Faculty assessments, direct observations combined with that questioning around clinical reasoning. You cannot assess professionalism, interpersonal teamwork, or communication skills and aspects of system-based practice without multi-social feedback. You just can't, right? And we know this is difficult. This is one of the more difficult tools to use, but it's essential. Audit and performance data around quality and safety is important. Even if you can't attribute it to the individual, they need to be able to work with that data. It's critical for practice-based learning and improvement in systems-based practice. In red here are nice to have at the moment. As I mentioned, I don't think simulation will be a nice to have in the future. I don't know when that future is coming. But as we see more and more evidence of translation from the sim out into patient care, it's going to get harder and harder not to start in a sim lab to some degree. And then if you have an in-training exam, obviously it's a great way to measure medical knowledge, right? Kind of in vitro in a controlled setting. As you design your programs of assessment or program assessment, this is a nice article from Karen Hauer about the 6 success principles that are really important. It needs to be centrally coordinated. That's why your program coordinators are absolutely essential in a program of assessment. We talked about multiple assessment tools, but they need to be used longitudinally, and learners need to have ready access to that information and feedback. This is where I really like to use Don Berwick's adage, nothing about me without me, right? I think that's true for assessment. Coaching, as we talked about, essential. You've seen coaching repeatedly in various aspects of these models. We have to foster self-regulated learning behaviors. That's why I mentioned that learners have to be self-regulated and active agents. And then you need expert groups. When groups function well, use effective group practice, they make better decisions. We now know that from the research, not only in our field medicine, but other fields as well. Obviously, groups can make bad decisions if they're run poorly, and that is an issue. And so that group process, how it's done, is really important. So moving forward, I think these are some of our challenges. One is change management is always a challenge. As I was saying with Joanne earlier today, you know, the Greek philosopher Heraclitus back in 2000 BC said the only constant is change. And that actually was translated from his comment that no man steps into the same stream twice, right? Because of this constant flow of water. So we've known this. But a lot of times we treat change as this process without recognizing change also often involves loss. This is a wonderful observation from Linsky that, and that loss is our loss of identity. Particularly if we've been doing something a certain way for a long period of time, we're invested in it. We have passion. We care. You're all here as educators because you care about what you do. And so letting go of some of that can be really hard. I think competence in CBME, I wasn't trained in any of this stuff. And so it's just going to take time for all of us to get kind of caught up to speed and learn as the educational science matures and we learn these concepts that have been around a long time, how to apply them in our own programs. I do think we need to understand implementation science. It's not easy. It's not something, again, any of us is taught. I'll give you a couple examples in a moment. We're going to have to change curricula. Obviously, time and resources remain a big issue, but inertia has also always been a challenge, right? It's kind of easy to stick with what we're doing. It's tough to kind of make those shifts. And so I would encourage you to think about your changes as a translational science. As you know, this is something the NIH developed. They actually created these centers for translational change. I'm sure many of you heard the old adage that it took 17 years for beta blockers to be fully adopted in the care of AMI patients, even though there were studies in the early 80s that showed that it reduced mortality. It wasn't until the late 90s that it became standard practice. We have the same issue in medical education. It's no different. And so we need to think about these translational stages. And stage one is really just to improve the knowledge, skills, attitudes, professionalism, right, of our learners, the competencies, and target the individual and teams that are needed to do that. And then that should translate into improved patient care practices. This is again from Bill McGahey. And then we take it to the clinic and bedside. Because a lot of our pedagogical or educational science can actually be really helpful to patients too. They need to be integrated. And then there's something called the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research, which has kind of 5 components. And I just want to introduce it to you. There's this concept of the outer setting. This is what's happening in the community and the institution. How supportive is it of your change, right? Who do you need to talk to? Remember, this is actually one of the primary foci of the clinical learning environment review. Our CLEAR program is to get the outer setting, the C-suite, to understand how important it is to integrate the learners into the institution and the community because they're providing a lot of care. They're taking care of a lot of folks as they're also concomitantly learning. And then the inner setting is kind of like what's happening within the various units in your institution. What Paul will tell them called microsystems, your intensive care units, your radiology suites, and so forth. And then as you think about the program, what's the level of programmatic assessment? What's happening there? Okay. And then within that program, if you have an intervention, what are the characteristics that make it work? If we think in terms of assessment, what are the characteristics of that assessment that's making it easy or hard to use, for example, feasibility? The others, are they interconnected or is these all just a bunch of disjointed processes and not really well integrated? And then finally, who are the individuals involved? Who are your stakeholders, from the learners to the faculty to others that are really important? For example, do you have a physician champion to help you with this? This is just an example of intervention characteristics from that model about all the things you need to think about if you were actually to implement a new assessment tool, right? And this kind of review helps you to avoid problems, right? Before you kind of launch it. It's worth going through this before you start something new to say, is this really going to be worth the cost? How complex is it to use it? Maybe we should trial it first. Right? Can we adapt it for our local needs and so forth? And then as you think about with milestones, this is just known as the knowledge to action model. One of the reasons I put this up here is to recognize that this is an iterative journey and it's okay. It's really messy. We know that these are hard to use. It's a big shift in mindset. We also know that a number of the milestone sets kind of round one weren't very good, to be honest. And so, you know, working with the community and kind of experts in the field, that's why we're at milestones 2.0. And believe it or not, in the next couple of years, we'll take a look at our data and say, are these working as intended? Do we need to make changes? Working with the community. Our goal is to keep changing them on you all the time, but we also don't want to leave stuff out there that just isn't working. That makes no sense for something that's meant to be mostly formative. But you'll undergo this constant loop, and that's okay. Right? You just get a little better each time. We've seen that in our research that even programs have their own developmental journeys, and they make small iterative changes along the way, and they just get better at it a little bit at a time. And then I'm going to end with this concept of co-production. So I think this is a really helpful concept as you're beginning to make these changes. One of the things that the folks who work in co-production point out that healthcare medical education is about providing a service, not making products. I actually don't like referring to our residents as products, not products, right? They're folks that are learning how to provide service. And so co-production is a good way to think about it because remember, two parties are always involved in making a service. And each party brings expertise. That expertise is often in the form of a lived experience. With patients, their lived experience in having a chronic disease, for example, is really important. For learners, they've had a lived experience prior to coming here for their residency program through medical school that we should take advantage of. And some of those experiences aren't always all that pleasant. Again, might involve things like bias, all right? And we need to understand that as they come into our system. And so services, when they're done well, are always co-produced. And so this is the co-production cycle for health professions education, right? You kind of start with co-assess. Where do things stand? Where am I? So as you think about it in the terms of the milestones, that biannual, we hope that you're actually having a sit-down meeting with your residents. You're reviewing that and saying, like, so where are we, right? Where to next, right? You kind of co-decide on those next steps in that individualized learning plan. You design what that would look like. So in order to get better at X, I need to do the following activities. Maybe it's I need more observation. Maybe I need to go into the sim lab. Or maybe it really is just targeted reading. And then you deliver that change and you see how it goes over the ensuing months. And then you sit down again and say, like, so how did that go? Did I achieve the goals I wanted to on my individualized learning plan? But it's always done in collaboration, with the learner. They're always part of the process. And so I think moving forward, if we're going to accelerate the adoption of CBME and really acquire a more developmental mindset in the way we approach our curriculum and our assessments, we're going to have to think about how we better integrate curriculum and assessment together. Again, I'm glad to see we're transitioning away from over-reliance on time and volume-based proxies. They have their place, but they're crude, right? The more that we can measure directly what they're able to do, the better. I think the core components, those 5 core components, are really important. And learners can be our partners in this. They can help us figure out how to implement that. Treat them as active agents, co-produce with them. I do think at some point we have to rethink our rotations. I'm not saying rotation should go away, but I do worry that sometimes we're kind of too reliant on the rotation and X number of weeks and something as being sufficient without thinking about, okay, at the end of that 3 or 4 weeks, whatever it was, are they where they need to be at this stage of their training, and how do I know that? And can we design it a bit more proactively? I know it's easier in the latter stages of training, and it's much harder in the earlier stages. Oops, sorry about that. And then I think we're going to have to embrace some implementation science. And that's not to say we all need to become implementation science experts, but we need to tap into expertise locally. Folks like Jessica, who does the faculty development, thinks about implementation and translation to help us make some of these changes. Because a lot of times we come up with a great idea and we just rush and we put it into use without really thinking through the steps necessary to do that well. Trust me, guilty as charged. Done that, been there. And as you can imagine, some of that didn't go real well because I didn't think through all those various steps necessary to at least give it a better shot of being successful, and just letting go when it wasn't working. And that's going to happen. That's okay too. Not everything's going to work. And when it doesn't, you let it go. And so with that, I'm going to stop. And this, my email, feel free to contact me, but I would love to take questions and any reactions you have to the talk. Questions? Yeah, please.
reducing the number of years for their training because they've already met the competencies or they have the ability to do what we're asking them to do?
Theoretically, the answer to that's yes, and it's actually been demonstrated that can happen, depending on program design. I think right now it's very difficult in our system for a couple reasons. One is the reality is we rely very heavily on residents to provide patient care services, right? You know, it's kind of frontline providers. So if you start pulling them out of that, are we able to kind of provide enough manpower, person power, better term, for that? And that's gotten in the way. Financing is probably not as big a deal if you're having somebody leave early. But we now have multiple pilots that have shown you absolutely can do this. The Toronto Orthopedics pilot, which used a mastery-based mindset in designing its program, they would start in a sim lab before going out. They actually had folks who would have typically been in a 60-month program finish at 42 months. So it's doable, but you got to have the resources, the commitment to do that. So I don't think that's going to be common in the near future. I think what I'd like to see is what a lot of folks refer to this hybrid kind of approach. Like, okay, you can't let them go early, but boy, you can certainly redesign their educational experiences. For example, in that last year, to be much more tailored, using that core components mindset to prepare them to where they want to head to next. There are several pilots that are trying that. It's called promotion in place, where they can't go early. But what they're doing is that they're giving them more responsibility within the context of the institution, or letting them kind of begin training in a fellowship, for example. So this kind of concept of blending, where, okay, you know what, you're actually really doing well and you want to be a cardiologist. Let's have you start your cardiology fellowship in that last 6 months, right? And we are seeing some of those pilots bubble up through our advancing innovation and resident education pathway. So yeah, Jessica, I mean, we now know you can. It takes effort to do that. But I don't think from a systems perspective, we have the kind of infrastructure in place to do it, widely at the moment.
Thank you.
Yeah, please.
With a simulation lab being so effective, I know a lot of residency programs nationally might not have the funding.
Yep.
Is there any advocacy work on ACGME for nationally, government-wise, to get more funding for programs?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So interestingly, as a 501(c) nonprofit, we're not allowed to lobby at the government level, but we can educate. And so that's what we're trying to do. There's been a lot of interest in the simulation community to set up regional consortia. I actually think that's more likely in the future, where there's kind of, you create a consortium and a center that everybody kind of contributes to that. And so I'm hopeful that we'll begin to see more of those, because I think we're just learning more and more that it's a very powerful place to start. It's not where you end. You still need to go out and take care, and do the do part, if you will. But I think for at least some of the basics, I'm using that loosely, it's going to be tough to argue that you shouldn't be starting in a simulator to some degree. Yeah. I would love to hear, I'm imagining we have residents in the room, is that correct? Are you all sitting on the right? Yeah.
Something like that.
Oh, sure. Yep. Okay, I want to talk to the residents for a moment. What do you think of all this? What struck you? Did it create terror? I'm curious. Honestly, this whole system is really to help you be, I hate to use an Army term as a Navy guy, but the best you can be, seriously, to make you as well prepared as possible. What struck you? Oh, thank you.
Maybe I should talk, but I'm a fourth-year med student. I feel like the system takes it as a whole as where you at or where you're at within your education, not maybe your like the individual need of like, you know, maybe my clinical exam skills are actually weak here, but my interviewing skills are good here. My knowledge of, you know, acid base is great here, but my, you know, I could take something that I'm proficient in. Looking at like curtailing a system that addresses the needs of that learner at that point, is that kind of where this model seems to be going?
That's where we'd like it to go. If this system really worked well, I love what you just described. You would feel comfortable coming to me and say, like, you know what, I'm pretty uncomfortable with certain aspects of my medical interview. Right? You know, can you come watch me? That to me would be nirvana. That you would feel comfortable enough to say, you know, I'm not really comfortable with acid base, or, you know, I feel pretty good here, but I'm struggling here, and I would really like some additional help. That would be nirvana.
But then I guess how would that affect your, then if you were my attending and we were rounding, how would that then affect your position of me as somebody trying to advance within the system?
So I can only speak for myself, but I would see that as a positive. I would see that as somebody who's reflective, who's willing to, you know, who's self-directed enough to want to get better at something, and actually came to work with me. To me, that would be a positive, right? Because when you leave residency, you need to do that on your own. I won't be around it. The fact you're willing to engage in that now is huge. Yeah, please.
Hi, I'm a coach resident. I want to say, like, fantastic presentation. How do you kind of anticipate the implementation of a lot of these concepts you talked about, in like the upcoming years? And what do you kind of see as like the major obstacles or blocks that might kind of make it part of the outcomes-based education?
Yeah, I think some of the barriers we've talked about, right? Time and resource, all those challenges, I think, are going to be in play in the next couple years. I think a big part of it is a lot of this is still new for all of us, including your faculty, right? We're still figuring this out. A number of the competencies we weren't trained in. I wasn't, to be honest. I wasn't trained in a number of those. So there's a learning curve for all of your faculty as well. There are some programs that have engaged in co-learning, where the faculty and residents learn together, particularly around competencies that nobody's comfortable with. Brian Wong has done some really nice work at the University of Toronto. I think we have to get comfortable doing that. It's okay, right? I can tell you, I have a number of deficiencies, and the only way I'm gonna, you know, just kind of work. And I think we have to kind of, that's where that co-production piece, I think, can be really helpful if we're willing to embrace it. Yeah, please.
I'm just wondering, because here we go, we also train the VA. Have you seen or any, there's multiple locations or multiple like healthcare systems, like public versus private, federal, if there's any?
Yeah, I think, you know, the VA is obviously very interested in this. They actually have a lot of trainees come through their system. I forgot the percentage, but I think it's over 50% of a resident will touch a VA of all the core specialties at some point in their training. It's pretty remarkable. And so they've got an office that's kind of dedicated to moving this, but it's the same thing. There's a lot of variability, and so they're kind of challenged dealing with that. We'll see. There are some closed health systems that are taking this on. Kaiser's a good example. They can also leverage some of their resources, particularly their medical record system. They are creating dashboards for their residents. And so that closed health system is given a bit of an advantage. Same with the military, where I originally came from. They're able to take advantage of some of that closed health system aspect. And then HCA, interestingly, has started a bunch of residencies, and they're trying to centrally coordinate it, actually out of Nashville, and making sure all the faculty are getting the training they need. So we'll see. So we might learn from those kind of some exemplars, but a lot of it's still going to be very locally driven, because everybody's context is a bit different based on where you are, who your population is, et cetera. So there's a lot of local context that's very important. Yeah. I'm cognizant of time, so please, sir.
With the development of tailoring a clinical training program for an individual, are we going to see a movement to less required rotations, for example, on the block diagrams?
I can only speak for me personally. I would hope so. I would hope we would get out of some of the rigidity around counting rotations. Unless you can show that they have some impact on outcomes. I understand the rationale behind it because it's really driven mostly by the concept of breadth, right? But at some point, just counting those months doesn't necessarily help. And as I said, during the pandemic, that all went out the window. For a lot of folks, they didn't get those months. So now what? You're not going to, and this is a big issue, by the way, particularly for the boards, because they relied on the kind of, program directors signing off that they got these experiences. Now they haven't had them, now what? And so, they made exceptions the last couple of years because they didn't have a choice. Otherwise, the entire system would have ground to a halt. Everybody, well, you didn't get that month of that, so therefore you can't. And so they made exceptions. And so I think we need to learn from that. And then I think what's appropriate flexibility? What does that look like? And again, if it's more based on outcomes, what folks need to be able to do, then maybe we don't need to be so heavily reliant on X months of X, Y, and Z. That would be my hope. Yeah. Yeah, please.
Question about the competency-based and outcome model on the scholar rotation, like and training and residency and fellowship. You also encourage the learner to do scholar activity, join the club.
Yep.
Also, so how you apply this model in that learning process in order for their scholar activity?
Yeah, so I actually think it fits pretty well. So under the practice-based learning and improvement competency, that's where that would fit. Either with a standpoint of evidence-based practice where you'll see descriptions there. The other is the reflective practice and scholarship. It's interesting that, believe it or not, there was a 7th competency originally proposed. It was teaching, and it ended up being enfolded. So it is embedded. I think the Canadians probably do a better job of being explicit about scholarship because it's one of the CanMed rules. And within our 6th general competency, it's more embedded. Yeah, but it's a really good point. Yeah. All right, I don't want to. I know folks have busy day jobs, so thanks for having me. I'm happy to stay here and take questions after.